wishing I could stop the fear. As the summer nights come near, we're locked inside our beds, but we laugh at what is said. Remember how it all begins. A little smile from your friends. I give you my small hope when things get broken. We feel more of us. This place is such a mess, but we always pass the test. When you feel like looking up, when the days are getting tough, we're getting us that drug. A little bit's enough, when all that's left is love. The world is different now. We feel more of us. This place is such a mess, but we always pass the test. When you feel like looking up, when the days are getting tough, we're getting us that drug. A little bit's enough, and all that's left is love. There is a crowd in here that fooled themselves. They brought their friends and they made their hell. They faked their grin in a lonely cell to the bitter end. But what do I know? There are a few in here that hurt themselves. They kick and bend in a dried up well. They call for help and you know them well. Are you aware? But what do I know? I will not surrender. No, I will not surrender. No, I will not surrender. No, I will not surrender. When God falls fast asleep, the kids still dance in city streets. From the White House lawn to the Middle East, and all around, I'm just saying that this time I feel it now. When God falls fast asleep, the kids still move to a
Welcome, everybody. It is so lovely to see you here. My name's Sarah. And I'm Laura. I'm a Gunda Jamara woman, and we're your MCs for today. We'll tell you a little bit more about us later on. But for now, I just ask that we join together and we just plant our feet firmly on the ground whilst we pay our respects and acknowledge country. So we are presenting and streaming to you today from Wurundjeri country. And we call to and acknowledge their elders, their ancestors, and the future generations of Wurundjeri people. And we pay our respect to their country and to the people and their totems, Bunjil the eagle hawk and Wah the crow. We are all connecting virtually over so many countries, and I extend this acknowledgement of country to your land that you're tuning into from with us today. We welcome all Indigenous people who are tuning in, and we extend this invitation to our non-Indigenous allies who have been helping us fight the good fight. Sovereignty on this land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Thanks, Laws. And whilst bringing you all of our energy today as your MCs, we also see the weight of the work the long history of the women's movement, and the fierce advocacy efforts of generations of feminists and victim survivors, which have created the family violence and violence against women sectors as we know it today. In honour of this, we will keep the fire burning over the next 2 days and always in our hearts. So take a really big deep breath, let it all the way out, and nestle back in to where you're comfy. It's so lovely to see you all here today.
We feel absolutely so privileged and so excited that we're back as your MC for this year. You might remember us from last year where we actually got to MC in person. We had a wonderful time in the city. But now we're still able to connect, and we're doing that through technology. So we're grateful for that. And we'll continue connecting, exploring, and activating.
Yeah, and it's so exciting that we get to use technology to do that. And I'm sure if our year's been anything like yours, it means that you've been doing a whole lot of this sort of stuff and using technology to connect. We've been running our Wella Women online retreat program online through Zoom as well. We've been really excited to be able to connect Aboriginal women right across the country online. And we've been running that under the Aboriginal Family Violence Innovation Fund, which has been, it's been really exciting.
It really has. Have a picture of us running our program?
Oh, we can. Let me find that for you, because this was one of the last times that we were actually able to hang out together in groups, and it's been a while since we've done that, but
sure has.
We'll be back soon.
So while we've, adapted and have been leading programs online, one of the other things that we've been able to do that we're really proud of is through our work at Closing the Gap, we've been able to continue to advocate and use our platform to free the flag. And that's a campaign that's really close to our heart and something that so many people have actually backed.
Yeah, and perhaps this year's also given you the opportunity to try new things, to create different conversations, and to shift that dial and create social change. Now, Loz, you did say that Free the Flag was as something really close to your heart. Everybody may or may not have noticed yet, but there is, where the sun should be in Laura's t-shirt, you might be able to see that there's a purple dot there because we are actually sitting in front of a green screen, which means that the artwork, the beautiful artwork that behind us, which is Laura's, really is quite close to her soul.
If you go. I love that.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about this? Because it's beautiful. I can say that because it's not mine. It's gorgeous.
Well, I actually created this for DVRCV pre-COVID. It feels like so long ago. And I was worried that perhaps the meaning of this artwork might not still be relevant given it's been so long. But when I reread the title of this artwork, Gathering for Purpose, look, I breathed a sigh of relief because I don't think it matters pre-COVID, post, or during this pandemic. Our values have remained the same, and the purpose of PreventX has remained the same, and that is to build peer-to-peer networks and create those important yarns about protecting women and children. This artwork actually shows different women coming together for purpose that prevents violence against women. And you'll see like these, I'm still getting used to it, these little U-shaped pieces of artwork. They represent people, and this artwork really does show the different configurations of people meeting together. And right now, if you look at this artwork and you think of it as a bit of a map, we're right in the center here, yeah? We're gathering and hanging out in the middle right now as a collective, and we're gonna experience connection in lots more different ways over the next 2 days. You can read more about the artwork on the back of the postcard, and there's also a really lovely opportunity to reflect or write your intentions that you would like to, reflect on during PreventX.
Yeah, maybe it's some notes, maybe it's a key takeaway, maybe it's somebody's contact details that you really want to follow up with after. Use that space to do what you need to with as well, and perhaps you'd like to share that with us on the PreventX notice board, which you will have a link to in your emails. We've also got a graphic artist recording our time together today, and I know you certainly like a good graphic reminder of the things that we've been working through.
Absolutely.
Can't wait to see that. So where else are we headed today? So we'll be hearing from the Minister for Women, and then Russell Vickery, who's the first queer survivor to share their story on national television, and then a fantastic panel moderated by Tanya Faha, followed by some really valuable time for us all to spend together connecting. So today, we really do encourage you to move as much as you need to. Make sure you grab a cuppa, stay hydrated, of course. shift spots if you can, do what you need to, because today is all about creating that space for you to lean in so that you can get as much as you can out of our time together.
And if you love socials as much as me, make
It
sure
really
you
does.
tweet, Instagram, Facebook, but using the hashtag PreventX.
Absolutely. So as I said, in your emails, you will have links to the PreventX notice board, where I have personally been absolutely loving the email updates from the DVRCV team. So thanks, team. They've been fantastic. In there, you'll also have the links to your Connect and Reflect sessions for a little bit later today. So if you're looking for something, check your emails, scroll down a little bit. They could be hiding in your junk. And then if not, the team can help you out.
So what have you got there, Lois? So everyone should have got one of these cute little packs.
Yeah, I ate my popcorn already.
Yeah, me too.
A long time ago.
With some goodies in it. So we're going to talk through what some of the special items in your little box. So you will find, well, let's start with the popcorn from Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander business Mabu Mabu. And Mabu Mabu is actually a Torres Strait Islander saying, which means help yourself.
I
We've
love
certainly
that.
done that.
Yeah, we well and truly did that. Noni's brilliant, so I love these. They smell so good.
They're so good. You will also find in there some cup of tea. So like Cez said, take a moment whenever you need during these 2 days to
have a break, have a cuppa.
We've got some pebbles, but we'll tell you about those later. But for now, just hold on to them. I think, I
It's
feel
nice
more
to play
grounded.
with. Yeah, absolutely.
And we've got some really, really cute stickers from the
The Equality Institute.
That's right.
It's like,
we actually love them a lot. We brought so much of their gear at our last conference.
Yeah, we really did. One of my favorite things to do is whenever we have meetings, we bought the Smashing the Patriarchy is my cup of tea mug, and it's my favorite thing whenever we have a meeting in the office, when that was a thing, right? I'd always make sure that the fellas at the table got those cups just to, prompt the conversation. But what does your sticker say, Lois?
Let's make a difference with all our differences.
Yeah, which reminds me, it's our differences that make us stronger together, but it's also really important that we approach that with respect. We all have a collective responsibility to make PreventX Online a safe and inclusive event where everyone can learn, engage, and be free from harassment and discrimination. We ask that you're considerate of others, that you respect and honour the diversity that everyone brings to the table, their ideas and experiences. Personal attacks and abusive, defamatory, or discriminatory remarks will not be tolerated in this space. We will distinguish between passionate arguments and toxic exchanges, and nasty conversations may require us to close comments or restrict access. If you have any concerns, or if you would like to report any inappropriate behaviour throughout the next 2 days, please contact prevention@dvrcv.org.au. And let's be kind to each other. So if today raises anything for you, we do encourage you to take some time for yourself and to seek the support that you need. We've got a list of support services behind us on the screen as well. So be kind to yourselves and be kind to others.
So to kick us off today, we will be hearing from Minister Gabrielle Williams, who is the Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence, Minister for Women, and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. Gabrielle would have loved to be able to present live today, but she's sitting in Parliament.
Yeah.
It's fair. But so this is pre-recorded. Gabrielle is passionate advocate for equity and social inclusion. She's also a keen pie supporter.
She is, which we learned in the Free to Fly campaign.
But all you have to do is stay right there and we'll hear the Minister's address right now.
Welcome to PreventX Online. It's wonderful to see such a strong and united group of prevention experts gathered virtually here today. This event recognises the importance of family violence prevention practitioners coming together to connect and share valuable ideas, experiences and insights. It's also a chance to reflect on the impressive work you all do and the achievements of the primary prevention sector as we continue to look towards our ultimate goal of Victoria free from violence. Your dedication to this goal has never been more important. As many of you will know, early research is showing that COVID-19 has created an international crisis for women's safety. We know that the pandemic has intensified the underlying drivers of violence against women, and that new research indicates that 1 in 10 Australian women have experienced family violence during this pandemic. 1/3 of those women are currently experiencing violence from their partner for the very first time. In this environment, primary prevention is more important than ever. We can change the social norms and systems that lead to violence, stopping it before it starts. And so as we start to look towards recovery, this event is an opportunity to think collectively about these priorities and goals. Can I thank the Domestic Violence Resource Centre for organising this very important event? Please know that your tireless efforts to adapt and to ensure that primary prevention efforts continue throughout the pandemic have not gone unnoticed. Your work is absolutely critical, and I can't thank you enough for your commitment and your perseverance. I wish you all an enjoyable, productive, and insightful conference.
Thank you, Minister. One of the things that I think, that Minister Williams spoke to that really, when we're thinking about how the landscape has changed so rapidly in the last little while, when we think about what that means for the sector at this time, it's changing those social norms and adapting. And I think the sector has done an incredible job at being agile in responding to what that's looked like at the moment. So thank you all for your hard work in that too. In responding to what that's looked like at the moment. So thank you all for your hard work in that too. So it's my absolute pleasure to move into our session with Russell next. So you may have heard the phrase "nothing about us without us," and it means that no policy or initiative should be created without direct involvement or guidance from the people that it is designed to help or impact. And we certainly know that, the importance of that as well in our work. For us, it illustrates the ongoing centrality of victim survivor voices to the effective work of prevention. So we're going to start the day by grounding our work and why we're all here with an important story, a story that demonstrates the impact that rigid gender roles, stereotypes, and homophobia have on people in our community. And Minister Williams spoke to that in changing those social norms. We know that the drivers of family violence against women and the drivers of violence in the LGBTIQ relationships and families are rooted in the same systemic and societal inequalities. As a sector and in partnership with the LGBTIQ community and organisations, we have made important gains in recent years to make sure that LGBTIQ people are visible in prevention work. In doing so, we're expanding our evidence base about what works to address the gender drivers of violence across our whole community, and co-creating even more and better approaches to prevent violence against all women and violence in all families and all relationships. Combining efforts makes our work stronger.
We would like to extend a warm welcome to Russell Vickery. Russ is a prominent advocate for the prevention of domestic violence in LGBTIQ relationships through his work with the Victorian Victim Survivor Advisory Group. You may also know Russ's story from his popular cabaret show called My Other Closet, The Cabaret. A banker by day and a community educator by night, Russ is passionate about dispelling myths surrounding family violence and improving pathways to recovery for survivors. And he was the first queer survivor to tell his story on national TV, appearing last year on the ABC TV show You Can't Ask That. So on behalf of Russell, we'd like to advise the audience that his story includes descriptions of family and homophobic violence. So let's hear Russ's story.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that wonderful welcome this morning. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders of the lands from which we are all joining. I'm on Wurundjeri country and extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. My name's Russell Vickery and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the LGBTIQ representative on the Victorian Government's Victim Survivor Advisory Council, or VSAC. Through VSAC, the voices of lived experience are centred in the Victorian family violence sector, and for the first time, LGBTIQ voices are part of this. I'm humbled and honoured to fill this role. Most LGBTIQ people's relationships are respectful, loving, and worth celebrating. But some of our relationships are based on power, control, fear, and abuse. I know this all too well because, of course, I myself am a survivor of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse in a gay relationship. Usually when I'm asked to speak in my role as VSAC rep, or get on stage with my show, My Other Closet, the Cabaret, I tell the story of what went on in that abusive relationship. I've since been told that in many ways, My Other Closet is a prevention project, as its message is that everyone deserves to feel safe and to love and to be loved without fear. Many of you will have heard my story before. If you haven't or would like to hear more, head to my website, myotherclosetthecabaret.com. Today, I'd like to talk about what it's been like sharing my story and the importance of including LGBTIQ lived experiences in the family violence work. I'm grateful to the generations of LGBTIQ people who have fought for our rights and equity, and as well as the generations of feminists whose fight has gained the ground on which the family violence sector is built. It's the coming together of these efforts that enables a role like mine to exist. I feel both humbled and privileged to fill this role as I strive to ultimately represent and honour the many LGBTIQ victims of family violence whose voices will never get heard. As I speak today, I am only one of a handful of LGBTIQ voices sharing their stories in Australia. As far as I know, I'm the only LGBTIQ person in Australia who has been given the formal recognition and amazing support and respect that VSAC provides. I recently had the honour of speaking at the opening of Pride in Prevention, which talks about the drivers of violence affecting LGBTIQ communities. Pride in Prevention talks about how society does not recognise our identities, relationships, and families, and the discrimination and violence we experience. This silence and stigma means that most people don't know that family violence happens to LGBTIQ people. And we even struggle to recognise that ourselves. Some of you may have heard me speak about when I tried to find help to escape my relationship. I was so desperate that I finally reached out to a service for support, but was told we don't have the capacity to deal with people with your lifestyle. Instead of support, I was dismissed. I felt like my experience, my story, was worthless. I felt like I was worthless. Talking here today, I think about that phone call and I wonder how different life would have been for me and my children if that person taking the call had valued me, believed me, and helped me receive the support I needed. I could have endured many, many less physical injuries and maybe avoided enough emotional abuse that I would never have ended up in a place where taking my own life seemed to be the only escape. Since becoming the LGBTIQ representative on VSAC, I've spoken with many people in my communities who have had very similar experiences. They tell me stories about how the system and society don't believe them or want to help them. And I'm left wondering how many of these stories, unlike mine, don't have a happy ending. When I first joined VSAC, I wasn't sure where my story would fit in. I felt nervous about walking into that room as the only LGBTIQ person there. I was welcomed to the council by Rosie Batty, who acknowledged the importance of an LGBTIQ voice on the council and who has been one of my strongest supporters. Working alongside the amazing women who form VSAC helped me realize how closely aligned our experiences were. The moment when I truly felt like I belonged was when they all said the same about me and my story. Each VSAC member has their own unique experience of family violence. There is an enormous amount of camaraderie between us. We believe that no one's experience is more or less valuable than any others. Each of us contributes to empowering each other. And sometimes the similarities in our stories are uncanny. As mentioned, I had the opportunity to share my story on ABC's You Can't Ask That, on an episode about family violence. I was the only man and the only LGBTIQ person amongst 7 women. Thankfully, I was filmed alongside Geraldine Bilston. Since then, we've become close friends and allies, and this year, Geraldine joined VSAC and became deputy chair. I think there is a wider lesson to be learnt from our experience, and with her permission and blessing, I'm going to read you a quote from her. I remember it made me nervous when the producer told me I would be seated next to a male victim for filming. I was quite surprised to meet Russell and his husband outside the studio. I hadn't considered that the male would be a gay male, or really even considered that abuse could even happen in gay relationships. I remember then feeling curious about how we would interact, but confused about how our stories would align, or if they would have anything in common. It took us 3 hours of taping, and if you watch the episode, you can see my genuine reaction of awe and camaraderie on the camera. Russ and I shared so much similarity through our experiences. It really affected me deeply. On reflection, I better realized that it was not simply me being female that had made me vulnerable to domestic abuse. Connecting with Russ helped me see that it could happen to anyone of any gender. This helped me better see that it was not my fault, or the fault of my gender, but that the fault always lies with the perpetrator who chooses to use violence. And the same goes for Russ, and for all victim survivors, regardless of gender and sexual orientation. This is the camaraderie I felt. Thanks, Geraldine, I felt that too. An issue behind closed doors can never be addressed until it's talked about more openly and met with understanding and empathy. It has never ceased to amaze me how many audience members have come forward at the end of my cabaret show who were experiencing or had experienced family violence. Many of them told me that hearing my story and the reactions of the audience had helped them realize that they weren't alone and that they mattered. Most of these people were women. My experience of family violence was the worst time in my life. My advocacy has been the light out of the darkness, and I used my story to help others find their way and to support service systems to do better to meet our needs. Now it's time to give all stories like mine a new ending by changing the beginning. How? By preventing it before it happens. I'm just one person telling one story from one perspective. And there are many other stories that need to be told and need to be heard. I believe that listening to LGBTIQ lived experience benefits everybody in society. Rigid gender norms hurt all of us. Simply by living our true selves, LGBTIQ people already challenge these ideas. We need to listen to more LGBTIQ stories to improve our services and to enrich the work of preventing family violence. To make this happen, we need your help in breaking down the barriers that prevent us from doing so. We need your help to challenge the silence and the stigma that stand in our way. Working together, we can create a society where people of all bodies, genders, and sexualities can live free from violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Russell, for sharing your story, an incredible story with such honesty and grace. I think your story, and like you said, it's just one story, one of many, will help ground the work that we do and continue to do in this space.
And changing that narrative from the very beginning. So we'll now spend some time looking back on the year that has been 2020. Each of us has experienced challenges this year differently. And as we move into what will hopefully be a period of recovery, it's important that we create that space to reflect. We're lucky enough to be joined by a panel of Victorian primary prevention sector experts. Now, you're all experts in your space, but these are some experts in their space, who will be discussing how the pandemic and other disasters amplify existing inequalities. And haven't we felt that this year? What this has meant for practitioners on the ground and how we as a sector can work together to rebuild a fairer and more equal post-COVID society.
So Tanya Faha will be moderating our panel today. And before I hand over to Tanya, and she'll introduce the panel, I'll just introduce Tanya. So Tanya is the CEO of two merging organisations, the DVRCV and Domestic Violence Victoria. Before joining us this year, Tanya has worked locally and abroad, focusing on prevention of violence against women and family violence and community safety and inclusion. You can check her out on LinkedIn and get her full bio from the program. Her track record and work history is truly impressive. And we thank Tanya today for her commitment and for moderating today's panel. So we're just waiting for Tanya to, technology things, join the panel.
I really do encourage you, if you've got a moment, jump on and check out the bio of Tanya as well. Let me just find her slides. We'll be joined by Adele Mordulo, Carla McGrady, Deb Parkinson, and Liam Leonard. So we'll bring you Tanya shortly. But while we're waiting for Tanya, was one of the things that I found really impressive about Tanya's bio is that she'd worked across the UN in policy prevention, which, that's enormous. So I think it's really exciting that when we think about two organisations merging together, that, at the helm of that is someone who has such a breadth of experience. And yeah, I'm certainly really excited to go and find out a little bit more about Tanya later. Well, when we're thinking about I guess changing that narrative and societal norms, we've been doing a little bit of work within this space as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we've been up to within the football club space?
Football club space?
Yeah, with the Fitzroy Stars in terms of changing narratives.
So we received the Fitzroy Stars received a grant.
A little while ago now.
It was. Yeah. God, time's changed. And it was called the Shining Stars grant. It was about creating sporting clubs that promote gender equity.
Yeah.
So it's been a difficult year, obviously, because there hasn't been any sport, but we've been working on doing audit of the club, surveying local community members about how we can make the football club a safer space for women
And when we're talking about changing the narratives, one of those things that we do a lot of campaigning and shifting the dialogue on using slogans and creating that sort of shift. What was the slogan that ended up coming out that has helped us to sort of shift that thinking around club spaces?
Well, I mean, and I guess for all of us, like we work in this space a lot and we have a whole lot of terminology and language, and for other people and community members who might not be in this space, that just seems like a lot of jargon. So we're like, how do we translate, gender equity in sports clubs into something that's real for, community members on the ground? And we come up with a slogan. It was quite simply, what's good for the boys is good for the girls is deadly for the club. So, when anything's going on in the club, everyone can literally ask themselves that question and say, the boys have got sponsorship packages. Do the girls have sponsorship packages? And why is this important? Because it's good for everyone. It's good for the club. It's good for the culture.
And when we're talking about, shifting rigid gender norms, trying to find those ways that are tangible and accessible for people on the ground sometimes is actually the hardest bit about it, because from a huge policy perspective, it can make perfect sense, but what that means when it's rolled out in person can often be really, really challenging to actually get the traction and the take up on the ground. So being able to put it into something as easy to understand and as palatable as a really cute slogan that fits on a billboard that goes around the fence around a football ground.
Look, I even put it on their training singlet. Put a few signs up above the boys' toilets. All those things. I think visibility of messages are really important. Like we wear our messages on our tees all the time, but at the club we can get the players to start wearing those messages and engaging in what that slogan actually means, and to have a deeper conversation around respect. And equity. And
equity, exactly. And access to those opportunities that make a really big difference. So we're just, I feel like we're having a little bit of technical difficulty in terms of getting Tanya on. What we might do is we can, Alice, our wonderful DVRC gem that's, helping us on the sidelines with a new wonderful folk at home can't see, is actually currently asking us whether or not we would like to moderate the panel.
I think Sarah would be brilliant at that.
I just threw you under the bus to talk about a project that you've probably not thought about for quite some time. I thought you did quite well.
Yeah, I was into it.
Alrighty. I feel like we've got Tanya coming. So I feel like I'm actually going to get to escape that bit. But I think you're completely right, Laws. And one of the things in terms of when we're thinking about just going back to palatable messaging that challenges that thinking and those stereotypes, it's also about enrolling champions, isn't it? I think that's one of the things that we've certainly seen be the take-up shift that's really changed that, that barometer. Alrighty, we're going to go to Tanya now. We'll see you in a moment.
So I apologise. So firstly, can I just, thanks to Sarah and Laura, and thanks for managing that transition. Firstly, can I also start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we are each meeting today. I'm on the land of the Kulin Nations in Victoria. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. So I'll just go straight into introducing the panellists. I'll just say that it's often commonly remarked, I guess, that the pandemic has further exposed the existing inequalities in our society. And in the successive shocks, I guess, of 2020, the gulf between those who have power and agency and those who don't has become clear. Historic expressions of inequality and oppression and action against them have surfaced in ways that are in Black Lives Matter protests that are still galvanising around the world, and one very visible response to this sort of exposure. This year, the prevention sector, our sector, has faced new challenges. The increased rates of violence during the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically increased the work of our colleagues in the response sector, and the intensification of rigid gender roles and disproportionate effect of the restrictions that are being felt by women and marginalised groups have made prevention work and what we aim to achieve, I think, even more salient. Today we'd like to spend some time, I guess, reflecting on 2020 and exploring what the emergencies and disasters that have characterised this year can tell us about what we must, about, I guess, the direction we must go in for the prevention sector and what we can learn and how we can harness this. I guess I just want to first introduce the panellists. Dr. Adele Modolo is joining us. Adele is the Executive Director of the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health. Adele is a second-generation Italian migrant woman with a background in feminist research, including a PhD in History and Women's Studies. Her advocacy and research work centre around the topics of violence against women, women's health, feminist history and activism, with a specific focus on migrant and refugee women. She's an honorary senior research fellow at the Centre for Health Equity at the University of Melbourne. So welcome, Adele. Carla McGrady, proud Gamilaroi woman from northern New South Wales. She is an emerging practice manager in the Practice Leadership Directorate at Our Watch. Her role oversees 5 projects supporting the implementation of primary prevention evidence base into practice. Carla has been involved in the development and implementation of Changing the Picture, a national resource to support the prevention of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their children. So welcome, Carla, great to have you. Deb Parkinson is a research fellow with Monarch Disaster Resilience Initiative and researcher for women's health in the North and Women's Health Goulburn, North Eastern Victoria. Over the past 2 decades, her research has included intimate partner violence, partner rape, women's unequal access to the legal system, and gender discrimination through the superannuation system. Since 2009, her research has focused on environmental justice and gender and disaster. In 2015, the Gender and Disaster Pod was established with Deborah as its manager. Welcome, Deborah. And last by no means least, Liam Leonard is an associate with the GAD Pod and has over 25 years experience as a social policy expert and LGBTI advocate. He's a past director of Gay and Lesbian Health Victoria, which is now Rainbow Health, and has been instrumental in developing Australian LGBTI health and wellbeing policies, programs and legislative reform, including the Rainbow Tick, and is working on research looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on primary prevention and the LGBTQI plus family violence. So thank you for being here too, Liam. Looking forward to this panel. Can I just please ask anyone who has questions for the panel, can you please put them in the chat box as we go? And our moderators will select some if we have time at the end of the panel discussions. So I guess without any further ado, I'll get straight into it. So I guess my first question is that family violence and violence against women and girls in 2020 is being discussed as the shadow pandemic because it's essentially overshadowed by COVID-19. So I guess I'd like to begin today's discussion by inviting each of our panelists to tell us what this phrase means in the context of their prevention work. So maybe we'll just start with you, Adele, and then we'll go to each of the panelists.
Thanks so much, Tanya. I would also just very quickly like to acknowledge that I'm meeting here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present here today. So, and also to people here today, sorry. Thanks, Tanya, for that question. I think it's a really interesting one when we're thinking about migrant and refugee communities because there are so many parallels between how COVID-19 has panned out and how violence against women, migrant refugee women, manifests itself in Australia. And one of the things that I've noted is that we see migrant refugee women overrepresented in the numbers of people who have been impacted by the virus. So they've been more likely to be infected, much more likely to become unwell with the virus. So we've seen a lot of older women who have been infected actually passing away. I don't actually have numbers on this, so I'm sorry about that. I don't think we're ready to have a look at country of birth data. So I can't say it definitively, but certainly from our perspective, migrant and refugee women have been very disproportionately impacted by the virus. At the same time, when it comes to violence against women, they're much more likely to be in the crisis end of the system, much less likely to have services that they can access at an early point or to be a part of prevention programs. I think the other parallel is really in the inequality that you mentioned before, Tanya, there where we see the impacts of inequality on the basis of race and gender and class really playing out in relation to the pandemic, as well as in relation to prevention of violence against women, so in inequality. So I guess we could say that the drivers of violence against migrant and refugee women can be seen as parallel to the drivers of an adverse impact of COVID. Then just two other things that I'd like to mention about the way that COVID parallels with violence against migrant women is the way that culture has been used as a bit of an excuse. So quite wrongly, we often blame culture as being one of the drivers of violence against migrant women. So it's, well, that happened because it's a part of her culture and she just puts up with it because it's a part of her culture. They're much more likely to be violent in those communities. So obviously I'm saying these are stereotypes. I'm not agreeing with them in the slightest. And also, as we've often seen migrant communities almost blamed for their own vulnerability in relation to the virus. So it was about, at times people were saying it was because big families were coming together and, I was asked sometimes questions about, well, isn't it hard for migrant communities not to gather and to self-isolate? When in fact the problems were not cultural, the problems were structural and they were systemic. The other point I'd like to make is about the use of community leaders to communicate. I know, again, we heard a lot that government were communicating with community leaders. And as we know, community leaders are often men, and women from migrant communities were excluded from that engagement and excluded from decision making. And again, we see that as a parallel within the violence against women field. So lots to think about there about the parallels.
Yeah, thanks, Adele. That's really cool. I'm sure we'll come back to more discussions about migrant refugee women through this. Maybe I can go to you, Carla, and you can tell me a little bit about what that phrase meant to you.
Thanks, Tanya. And I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'm meeting with you from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people in Brisbane, Queensland at the moment, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also acknowledge my people, the Kamilaroi people. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's been quite the journey, I guess, for all of us over the last sort of 6 to 8 months. And I think, one thing from our Watchers' perspective in particular is, regardless of the fact that we are in, the midst of a once-in-a-generation worldwide pandemic, I think what it's really highlighted is that systemic and structural issues that affect all of us, but particularly marginalised groups of people. And talking about it, as a shadow pandemic, I think highlights the fact that these issues don't go away just because there is a bigger crisis taking place that affects everybody. And I think what this has really sort of brought attention to is the fact that these things don't go away. Women are still experiencing extremely high rates, if not higher rates of violence during this whole pandemic. People who are impacted by racism and other forms of discrimination. We've also seen the way that they have either increased or the impacts are much more severe for them in terms of how they are supported through this kind of crisis, or how they aren't supported as well as they could be through these kinds of situations. And it also just shows that, you know, racism doesn't take a pause because there's a bigger health issue that's occurring. These things, just like we talk about in Changing the Picture with sexism and racism, these things still continue. And the impacts of that are often felt more sharply by those who, you know, are impacted by these types of things. I think one kind of really standout example for me is what is occurring on the lands of the Djabwurrung people at the moment. You know, Victoria in particular has really borne the brunt of this pandemic. But while that's occurring, you still have the destruction of Indigenous lands taking place simultaneously. That still doesn't get deprioritised despite the health crisis that is occurring. Colonisation as a machine continues to move forward, and, you know, consideration for even cultural heritage is still not a thing that gets thought about differently, despite the fact that we are all in the middle of a pandemic. And, you know, fines that people are occurring. We've seen the conversation that's occurred around the Black Lives Matter march, and like Adele was talking about, you know, marginalised people being blamed for their own situation. But in the case of the march that took place in Melbourne, you know, also being blamed more largely for what's occurring in society without any evidence to support those theories. And so it's been, you know, interesting. It's been, you know, enough to make you sort of angry. All of the things that you feel about all of these situations that, particularly, you know, for me as an Aboriginal woman, I see the situation that my people and Aboriginal women are in. But you also have seen the way that Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal organisations have come together to deal with this, knowing that the support that we should be entitled to from systems and from governments is not necessarily going to be there, and that if we are going to come out the other end of this, then we have to lead that ourselves. And as organisations and as health services and as community groups, that priority for us has been that we have to, you know, step up to that plate and take the lead and determine for ourselves what it is that we need and really be strong about that. And it's been, you know, pretty incredible to watch that happen, and, you know, the positive impact that that's had with the low number of cases that we've seen in Aboriginal communities right across Australia. So, yeah.
That's very sobering, I think, to some of those points you made about the ongoing, you know, systemic inequalities that exist there. But calling out what a fantastic job Aboriginal communities have done for and with themselves for health and well-being. So thank you. Can I now maybe invite Deborah to give me your perspective on that question?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. I'd like to acknowledge the Djabwurrung people, the traditional owners of the land where I am, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to you, Carla, and any Aboriginal people here today. When I heard the word overshadowed, it reminded me of 2012 when we had the first conference to really share the results of the research we'd done with women who were affected by domestic violence in the context of the Black Saturday bushfires. We called that the hidden disaster. That's because women were really effectively silenced from speaking out about the violence against them. That was because men were seen to be traumatized, possibly suicidal, maybe unemployed after the fires, and often because they'd been good guys, heroes, on the back of the CFA truck. And what the sense we got for the emergency management sector was, don't talk to us about gender, don't talk about family violence, we've got an emergency on our hands. Our conclusion in the report, we actually wrote, when the stakes are high, it is men's interests that will be protected, and our commitment to the notion that women and children always have the right to live free from violence is revealed as conditional. So in 10 years of studying and being engaged with the emergency sector to consider gender and disasters, this really hasn't changed, and it's playing out again in COVID. I can see a greater willingness to talk about increased violence against women in COVID, probably because the hero aspect is not involved. We see these reports coming out, the evidence is piling high about the pink recession and discrimination against women and violence. Headlines everywhere. You do a Google search, it just comes up in the tens and hundreds. There are panels of experts all being outraged about it. So to me, in a sense, it's even worse when we know it's happening, we talk about it happening, but I'm yet to see any real action on prevention of violence against women.
Thanks. Deborah. Thank you. Thanks for that insight. And Liam, can I invite you to say a few words about your perspective on that? I think you might be muted, Liam.
Is that better? I hope that's better. Yes?
Much better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nations, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I should point out that I don't work in primary prevention, and my engagement with primary prevention over the last year has been as a researcher with the GAD pod with Deborah. And in a previous life, I worked on primary prevention, looking at developing what I called heterogendered models of family violence. That's models include violence against women, but also heterosexist violence against LGBTIQ+ people. So in thinking about this question, I'm addressing it really from my work as a social policy researcher and as an LGBTIQ+ advocate. And I'm going to do a fairly narrow description. Clearly, the statement is a rhetorical gesture, and it highlights the need to address the increased rates of family violence against women by their male partners during COVID-19. But I also think there are some very unhelpful confusions, as well as the positives that people have talked about in this statement and the way it's framed. First of all, it implies that family violence and violence against women and girls can be understood as a disaster, in this case as a pandemic. But secondly, it assumes or compares family violence against another novel but prolonged disaster, in this case COVID-19. And I think what the gesture does is it takes one disaster at the expense of the other. It implies that the disaster against women and violence against women and girls is somehow being overshadowed by a second disaster. So picking up on what a number of people have said, family violence is not a disaster, I'd argue, nor are increases in family violence during COVID-19. Rather, what I call heterogendered violence, that's violence against women and children and LGBTIQ+ family violence, are effects of, as they reproduce, heterosexist structures, processes and practices on which white male heterosexist privilege depends. Another way of putting this is to say that heterosexist violence against women and children and sex and gender identity diverse minorities is a socio-structural feature of societies like Australia and not a consequence of a disaster or a pandemic. So from my point of view, the relationship between family violence and COVID-19 isn't one between two disasters or two pandemics. Rather, it's a relationship between a disaster, in this case COVID-19, and the drivers of violence against women and sexual and gender identity minorities. We know, as Deb has pointed out, that under disaster conditions, there's a magnification of existing gender inequalities, which in turn lead to an increase in rates of family violence against women by their male partners. COVID-19 is similar to other disasters in magnifying this heterogendered inequality, and with that, driving increasing rates of family violence. But I want to say that unlike other disasters such as bushfires, floods and earthquakes, the pandemic is prolonged. It has led to extended periods of statewide lockdowns and social isolation. And as I hope to discuss later, it's consolidated some gender stereotypes while challenging others. So from my point of view, the dramatic and prolonged increase in heterogendered family violence during COVID-19 in Australia and overseas has demanded a response by governments and family violence agencies. While the focus has been on response, it has nonetheless opened up spaces within organisations, within government and within the mainstream media for discussion of the drivers or causes of those increases in rates of family violence. And it has provided an opportunity for a much broader public discussion about the importance of prevention. So to conclude, from my point of view, in one case, COVID-19 has overshadowed family violence, but in another, it's actually spotlighted that violence and provides an opportunity for broader discussions of the heterogeneous drivers of violence against women and girls and the need for a renewed focus on prevention as we move out of COVID. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam. Yes, and let's hope we can use that opportunity to progress some of that important discussion, I think. Whilst we've just heard from Deborah and Liam, I think my next question is really about the Gender and Disaster Pod. The Gender and Disaster Pod was formally established to promote an understanding of the role played by gender in survivor responses to natural disaster and to embed these insights into disaster management practice. Much of this work has been informed by research following the 2009 Black Saturday fires. Deb, can I start with you? Like, what does the work of GADPOD tell us about how the gender drivers of violence articulate in disaster preparedness and response, and how can these lessons be applied to prevention work?
Okay, thank you, Tanya. So I'm going to start my 6 or 7 minutes by addressing the conference question about what have we learnt and where do we go from here. So we've learnt that disasters in Australia are not limited to catastrophic fires, droughts, flooding plains, but it can be a daily reality for city dwellers as well as rural people. Disasters and violence against women go hand in hand. The disaster can be visceral and terrifying, instantly threatening and even killing people. It's not hard to bring to mind images of the Black Saturday bushfire, which created its own weather system in the smoke and the flames. It destroyed whole communities, or images of devastating floods across Queensland and cyclones. The cause of pandemics and epidemics is invisible to the human eye, but the same consequences are felt in deaths, physical and mental health, ill health, and widespread massive economic impacts. The audience today is interested in the primary prevention of violence against women. You know that such stresses don't cause family violence, but it is proven that increased rates of family violence accompany and follow disasters. The data shows that there are no geographic borders for this phenomenon. From Bangladesh to the UK, Pakistan to New Zealand, disasters bring both increased risk and increased experience of domestic violence. For primary prevention, 2 things happen. The gendered drivers of violence are exacerbated in disasters like COVID and bushfires, and at the same time, the causes of violence against women are reinforced. Disasters give us the opportunity to think into both drivers and causes. I'll speak first about 3 drivers. First, prescribed and stereotypical gender roles become more entrenched as decision-making in public life is dominated by men or patriarchal forms of power and authority. In bushfires, we can add elevation of masculinity to almost hero worship of firefighters who are predominantly male. Journalists are sent out to find images of sooty heroes and women with babes in arms. In the private domain, men are unreasonably expected to protect and provide, and women to put their own needs last for the good of the man, the family, and the community. Childcare is unrelentingly demanding, never more so than in the high stakes of a bushfire or in homeschooling in COVID lockdown. In these disasters, women's economic survival or personal survival is compromised by this responsibility. Second, gender inequality, pre-existing, is exacerbated in disasters. Disasters disproportionately affect the poor, and most of the world's poor are women, including in Australia. Our greater valuing of men in 2020 is still apparent in sport, in the persistent pay gap, in whose surname children are given, in whose name appears first in official documents, in unpaid caring roles. In disasters, it's visible in the gender hierarchy of the emergency management sector, in who gets awards for heroism, in who gets to choose what role to take on in disasters, in who gets to continue their career unencumbered by childcare responsibilities. Bob Pease writes of an ideology of gender that defines men and their activities as superior and women and their activities as inferior, even invisible. Another driver, the condoning of men's violence, is everywhere that heroic and hyper-masculinity is celebrated in disasters. This approach fails men as much as it fails women and children. We documented Black Saturday case managers refusing to collect family violence data, and this is a quote, out of respect for the man. We documented the structural and systemic silencing of women to prioritise loyalty to suffering men and to shore up the illusion of post-disaster community cohesion. We designed postcards called "Disaster is no excuse for family violence" to challenge this. First printed in 2012, they're still in print, and last year we distributed 10,000 across Victoria. So how can these lessons be applied to prevention work? Disasters give a rare opportunity to theorise about causes of increased violence against women. Principally, patriarchy, capitalism, racism, colonisation. The common factor is male privilege, understanding that men benefit differently from the patriarchal dividend. Inequality widens as people with privilege, power and resources profit from the chaos. Hard-won gains by minority groups, women, LGBTIQ+ people, people of colour and other marginalised groups are lost in disasters. This is not accidental. You would have heard of the window of opportunity that disasters offer. Conservative economist Milton Friedman wrote in 1962, he famously said, "What happens after a disaster depends on the ideas that are lying around." It's not what Friedman had in mind, but we can use this window to disrupt the regressive change that usually follows disasters. So here are 6 ideas of what we can do. Understand how power and privilege work. Recognise the Judas sheep, the women who benefit from patriarchy and betray the rest of us. Search for commonality with other marginalised groups. It's in the interests of patriarchy for us to ignore the oppression that they perpetuate and instead fight amongst ourselves for their tiny bits of benefaction, the crumbs from their table. Don't believe it when we're accused of being insensitive to men, that it's not all men, that in calling out men's violence we're causing more harm than good. Don't be shamed into complicity with violent men. Oppose governments using the tyranny of the urgent to push through policy and legislative changes that will increase inequality and cement patriarchy. And finally, stand up for women and children's right to live free from violence, even after disasters. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah. They're really interesting points, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to some of those. I guess my next question is for Carla. And Carla, I realise that some of these points, you know, you kind of alluded to earlier on, so this will make for a good continuation of some of those discussions. But I guess gendered inequality isn't the only form of discrimination that intensifies in times of crises, and we know that. We know the pandemic and other crises have been experienced disproportionately by Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander women, migrant refugee women and women with disabilities, and also Adele alluded to some of those issues before. However, at the same time, and in your opening comments, you made this point, we've heard many accounts of Aboriginal communities leading the way in the pandemic, planning, response and management, all of which illustrate the crucial importance of Aboriginal self-determination. I guess, Carla, as one of the authors of Changing the Picture, can you talk to us about the parallels between the essential actions required to prevent violence against Aboriginal women and children detailed in that publication, and how Aboriginal community responses to COVID have?
Sorry, Tanya, I missed the last part of your
repeat the question. Yeah, I'll just
question.
say, can you talk to us about the parallels between the essential actions required to prevent violence against Aboriginal women and children, which are detailed in the Changing the Picture, and how Aboriginal community responses to COVID have played out?
Yes, thank you. Changing the Picture talks about self-determination as one of the principles for, you know, addressing violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women here in Australia. And what we've seen occur in Indigenous communities right across the country is, you know, the epitome of self-determination, I guess, in seeing how organisations have rallied and organised to see numbers of COVID cases in Aboriginal communities right across the country under 200, I think, is the last sort of numbers that I'd heard of. I don't have exact numbers, sorry. But Changing the Picture, the way that we wrote that document, we did a lot of consultation with communities. And so the principles and the actions that are in that document are derived from the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as the literature and research that, you know, has been done over decades around this issue. What we've seen right from the get-go, and even before states and the federal government sort of got the jump on what was going to be needed to keep our people safe, Aboriginal health organisations, community health organisations primarily, came together to look at what needed to happen. We saw Aboriginal land council, what needed to happen. We saw Aboriginal land councils and communities close their, you know, close up shop essentially to keep, you know, mob safe. We saw public health messaging that considered the diversity of language groups within different Aboriginal populations across the country. We saw the use of social media in spreading this message to people, and articulated in a way that was, you know, respectful and considered where Aboriginal people were going to get their information around what was happening, and the importance of what needed to be done to keep each other safe. We saw a lot of animated videos with messaging, public health messaging around what needed to happen to keep people safe and why that was important, around taking care of our old people, and what all of us needed to do to make sure that our old people were kept safe. And it really just showed the strength of why a principle like self-determination is so important for working with First Nations people. And it just showed how important it is to listen to the voices of Aboriginal experts around the country who know what they need, who know what their communities need, who understand what the implications are if these voices aren't listened to. And, you know, the problems that we were facing at the start of this pandemic, and thinking about how we prevent that, basically, as a community and as a people. We saw Indigenous doctors, we saw academics, we saw epidemiologists, you know, all Indigenous people who came to the fore with their expertise, not only within the health field, but also as Aboriginal people, and understanding, you know, from a community perspective, what needed to happen and why that was important, because it wasn't just about public messaging, or it wasn't just about the health of people generally. This is our mob that we're talking about. And we know with comorbidities and other health issues that we face, that Aboriginal people were and are at a much higher risk when it comes to contracting COVID. I know from personal experience, my sister and her family contracted COVID, and it was quite terrifying to, you know, have that diagnosis and to just be really fearful of what that might mean. You know, thankfully they've all recovered, but we don't even know enough about this, you know, virus to understand what the long-term implications are. And so for Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal organisations to really just step up and take that really strong stance around what it was that they needed, and what needed to be done, and to do that themselves as community-controlled health services was, you know, of the highest standard in terms of what was and has been achieved in preventing the virus spreading through communities, not just in urban areas, but in regional, rural and remote areas. We've seen, you know, a lot of people often ask the question as non-Indigenous people around what it is that they can do to help as good allies. And Changing the Picture does talk about that, and talks about issues around racism and systemic and structural issues that, as Aboriginal people and as a minority in our own country, we often don't have the power to change the things that need to be changed. And we need, you know, not only for non-Indigenous people to listen when Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal experts speak, but then to do something with that information. It's not enough to just make space and hear what Aboriginal people are saying if you don't intend to do anything with that information. And I think especially, you know, it's highlighted in this pandemic that when that does happen, when Aboriginal people are listened to and what they say they need is actioned, the results really speak for themselves in seeing the benefit, not only for Aboriginal communities, but for everyone, in knowing, you know, what needs to be done and how it needs to be done and how effective that can be.
Yeah, I agree, Carla. I think there are some great lessons for the entire community from how and what Aboriginal communities have achieved during this time and beforehand too. So, yeah, I agree. Thank you very much for those insights. Adele, I might come back to you just in the context of your earlier comments about migrant and refugee communities. You know, we often say that it's important that approaches for prevention are fit for purpose for different communities, and that those approaches take factors like cultural values and language into account, as well as people's different experiences of systemic barriers or discrimination. So I guess the question for you is, how has prevention work played out for your organisation in the context of the acute inequalities and hardships for migrant refugee women and their families during that time? And what are the community-led solutions that have emerged or been maintained throughout 2020?
Thank you, Tanya. At Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, we do prevention work and early intervention of violence against women, both with women directly as well as with organisations in the multicultural sector and other sectors. So we build capacity for them to do work with their communities, and we also build leadership of migrant women and develop frameworks that are specifically tailored for migrant communities. So we do that kind of, a lot of the prevention work that we do could continue during the pandemic because we were working with organisations that remained open and remained operational. But there was also some of the work that we couldn't continue to do because it's mostly face-to-face with women who tend not to be digitally connected. So we did, as much as we could, we moved our work online. So we did some radio, we ran Zoom sessions with groups, but there were so many women who we would be able to connect with face-to-face in the past who we weren't able to connect with any longer. One program that we did run was within public housing over the phone. So luckily we were able to partner up with the Office for Housing and called women and their families when there was testing for COVID at their public housing estates downstairs at that time. So our main aim really was to call them women and talk to them about COVID and encourage them to be tested. But we would also make follow-up calls to make sure that we were able to address any other women's health issues as well, including family violence. And there were some issues that did come up during that time. So it was great to be able to reach women in that sense. But yeah, definitely, I guess it really accentuated the social isolation because even in the best of times, it is a big issue for migrant women, even for those who are working or, obviously are part of a community, but they don't necessarily have the family connections that they need because, increasingly it's difficult for whole families to migrate to Australia. So there's a lot more fragmentation of families through our migration program. So yeah, there is big social isolation, and that was accentuated during COVID. So yeah, a lot of our prevention activity did have to adapt to an online environment, or we had to stop some of our activity. I think the second thing that became, and this is something that, I guess picking up on some of the conversation that's already happened around the structural issues. And one of the things that was extremely apparent through COVID was the hierarchicalised labour force that we rely on in Australia, where migrant women, tend to be concentrated in casualised contract work within sectors that are not really valued for the work that they do. So they're in aged care, they're in, supermarkets, in food processing, all of which continued throughout COVID, but which put migrant women at an increased risk. So I guess it accentuated that workforce and the vulnerability that exists within that workforce. And I guess for us at MCWH, it did highlight that link with gender equality, because our prevention work is all essentially comes down to working towards gender equality or gender equity. And if through COVID we've become much more aware about this hierarchy within our workforce, which is built on class differences and gender differences and racialised differences, what does that mean for the kind of work that we're doing in prevention? Which really then needs to take account of all of those divisions and work towards gender equality for all, addressing all of those distinctions and divisions that we know about. think when we come to looking at solutions, definitely our solutions are need to be community-led. So I think I concur with a lot of the comments that Carla has made about the success within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities of having a community-controlled approach to something like the pandemic and, of course, to violence against women. One of the things that struck me during the pandemic was the way that people said that they relied on community leaders within migrant communities to really engage with communities and bring them along. But it was really striking that those community leaders were largely in unpaid volunteer roles. Even though essentially the health system relied on these community leaders to engage with communities and keep them updated with COVID-19 information, essentially they weren't a part of the formal system. They were organisations that had been set up for different reasons to support migrant communities. And then suddenly they were making food and delivering care packages, and they were the health information deliverers for their communities, or still either unpaid or very poorly paid. So I think that when I'm just struck by what you were talking about, Deb, in terms of the heroes of other disasters, like in terms of the heroes of other disasters like fire and flood, and they do tend to be the fireys and the more kind of masculine, I guess, the stereotypes of the heroes there. And it made me wonder, who are the heroes of COVID? And I think that in migrant communities, it has really been those community leaders. But whereas we put other heroes on a pedestal, these community leaders and people within migrant communities are largely invisible and unpaid or poorly paid. So I think that's definitely a gendered phenomenon as well, and also obviously race and class comes into it too. So definitely a community-led solution. Women and migrant women in those communities really need to be at the centre of the solutions, and they need to be supported, and we need to have an investment into their leadership and into them being able to take the lead within their communities. But I guess also thinking more systemically and structurally, if we've got a structural problem, we really need to find a structural solution. And if we're not able to take this opportunity to make some serious changes to our labour force, to address the higher rates of unemployment amongst migrant women, to address the lower rates of labour force participation amongst migrant women, to make sure that migrant women aren't continued to be concentrated in casualised, contract, poorly paid employment and industries. And also, I guess, finally, that once they do get a job that's maybe not in those industries, or any industry, in fact, that they're subjected to gendered and racialised discrimination and harassment. Unless we're able to address all of those factors within our labour force, I think we're going to continue to have inequality, gendered inequality, where migrant women continue to be kind of fairly, they're certainly not, we're not going to see significant gains in equality for that group. So the problem is definitely in the community, but we also need to see a legislative and systemic solution with migrant women's experiences placed at the centre of that solution, but essentially it really needs to be at a systemic and structural level.
Thank you. Thanks, Adele. And again, I think bringing into light the importance of working at different levels the ecological model like we do in prevention, structural systemic change, community change, and lots of parallels there. And I think community-led solutions is one of the most critical learnings, I think, and important successes that the Aboriginal communities have taught other communities as well, and we can all learn from that. So, Liam, over to you. You've been leading some research into the experiences of the prevention workforce during COVID. I guess drawing upon some of the examples, I guess, from the research, can you tell us how the prevention workforce is navigating their prevention practice during COVID? Shop to challenges.
Thank you.
Unexpected. Oh, sorry. Have you heard that question? Okay.
Most of it.
I guess what I really want to know is really drawing on some of the examples of your research, how the prevention workforce is navigating their prevention practice during COVID, and maybe you could use some challenges and unexpected benefits to illustrate some of these innovations.
Thank you. I've been working on 2 COVID family violence related projects. The first was looking at the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on LGBTIQ plus people's intimate and familial relationships. And that was done in partnership with Drummond Street Services and led by Beth McCann and Ellen Poyner and their excellent research team. And the second project is the one you've talked about, Tanya, which looks at the impacts of COVID-19 and COVID-19 restrictions on Victoria's family violence primary prevention workforce. That's been led by Deb Parkinson and myself, with Catherine Weiss, who undertook a really exhaustive literature review. And the project was supported by a really fabulous advisory group, some people who I see on screen and some people who I assume are part of the audience today. Unfortunately, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I had hoped to talk in detail about the findings of the primary prevention project, but both reports, the primary prevention and the LGBTIQ report, are awaiting final approval from Respect Victoria before the reports can be talked about and their recommendations made publicly available. So my first comment is, please check the Respect Victoria, Drummond Street Services and GADPOD websites for access to the reports, and particularly their recommendations and the lit reviews when they become publicly available. So that sort of put a bit of a dampener on what I might say. So before I go in and talk about what I think I can say, I wanted to address Adele's comment about disasters and COVID. We've developed some training packages for the GADPOD looking at the impacts, the gendered impacts of disaster. And one of the things about COVID is it does not fit well those heroic narratives of previous disasters. As you say, who are the heroes? You don't get our leaders dressing up in what I call disaster drag, the way they do for bushfires and for floods. The heroes are people in white coats, they're peak bureaucrats in blue suits. And of course, internationally, the heroes have been heavily gendered. It's people like Karensen in Iceland, or in Finland and Iceland, Ardern in New Zealand, who've adopted very non-heroic stances in relation to COVID. So COVID, in many ways, has turned out to be a gender-bending disaster in challenging those heroic myths, despite myths of many male leaders to absolutely transform it into something that's more heroic. And I want to come back to that. It just seemed a good point of entry. So what I can do briefly is, rather than talk directly about the research, I can talk about the work we've done with the GADPOD, Deb and I and her team, in developing these training packages, which informed very much the way we structured these research projects. I can also talk a little bit about the results of a study done by Women's Health in the Southeast, which was titled COVID-19 and Assessment of Partner Needs, which was a really excellent early project looking at the impacts of COVID on primary prevention workforce. And I can talk a little bit about some of the preliminary results from the primary prevention research we've done that we presented at a Respect Victoria forum, where I think that those results are already public. So to take a step back, what prompted the research? Well, the research was prompted by anecdotal reports very early on in the first lockdown that family violence resources and personnel were being diverted from prevention work to response. This appeared to be an immediate, unplanned and perhaps knee-jerk reaction to the dramatic and sudden increase in reporting of family violence against women by their male partners that actually accompanied the first wave of COVID-19 restrictions. Now, these anecdotal reports of a transfer of staff and resources from prevention to response was actually confirmed by the Weiss report. The Weiss report, partner agencies acknowledged the need to increase support for women experiencing family violence, but I'm quoting from the report, many of the partner agencies expressed concerns over, quote, the prioritising of response coming at the expense of primary prevention work. These concerns were confirmed by a group consultation the GADPOT undertook with 42 primary prevention workers who were members of the Municipal Association of Victoria's PVOR network, which we did on the 24th of June. And again, many of the consultation participants reported that primary prevention staff and resources were being transferred, not only to response, but to what I called other COVID-related urgencies, so to tasks not related to family violence at all. So if that's the background to the research report, why is the transfer of resources from under disaster conditions from prevention to response an issue? Well, as Deb has noted, under disaster conditions and during recovery from disasters, there is a ratcheting up and an increase in gender inequalities. This is true for COVID-19. In our training, we reviewed emerging Australian data showing increased pressure on women to conform to narrow female stereotypes during COVID-19. So data from an ongoing Melbourne University project showed that women in heterosexual nuclear family arrangements were taking up the bulk of increased childcare duties, including homeschooling and domestic duties under the first wave of COVID-19 restrictions. At the same time, the federal government's economic supports had favoured industries where men made up the majority of the workforce. We saw, as I've mentioned, male heads of state attempting to portray COVID-19 as similar in type and scope to more familiar disasters such as war, bushfires and floods, and requiring the same demonstration of male leadership and male heroics. I pulled a quote from Brazil's President Bolsonaro, which really makes explicit some of the sexist and homophobic dynamics behind many male leaders' unwillingness to indulge in what they saw as non-heroic, and we can read as feminine, behaviours. So Bolsonaro was reported as chiding his presidential staff who were wearing masks, telling them that masks were for fairies. So we see, as Adele pointed out, here is someone actually trying to turn COVID-19 into another heroic male disaster where they can ride in on a white horse and rescue people. The increasing polarisation of gender stereotypes under disaster conditions involves an amplification of the already unequal gendered sexual relationships between women and men. And I would argue this is one of the reasons it brings with it an increased risk of family violence. So obviously, to transfer resources from prevention to response at precisely an historical moment when the gender drivers of family violence against women are on the rise is deeply problematic. At the local level, in our report, we found that the redeployment of primary prevention workers to response or to other COVID-19 urgencies really did undermine many years of building up a primary prevention workforce and corporate memory in Victoria, particularly by the Women's Health Services. So some of the things that were potentially undermined by this transfer, and remember the transfer has gone on now for not just one wave, but two waves, undermining the greater understanding of the importance and range of primary prevention work, the potential to undermine the growth and consolidation of the primary prevention workforce, and undermining some of the development of primary prevention policy and program networks, which are absolutely vital within the family violence and community services sectors. If I can cheat a little bit and take some of the findings that I presented when we were discussing the preliminary findings from the report, and the report has a much more detailed set of findings. So please just take this as a taster in many ways. The first thing is many workers who were moved from prevention to response, because response had become such an issue within their organisations, they found that they had access to areas within their organisation to talk publicly about this outside their organisation, to access programs within their organisations that had never considered that they might have a role to play in primary prevention. So they could use their shift to response as an opportunity to raise awareness of prevention and the gender drivers of family violence against women. And that's an ironic opportunity, but they said many of them felt that that raised awareness would stand them in good stead to actually promote prevention more broadly within their organisations as we move into whatever a post-COVID situation might look like. What we found was that for those workers who were in organisations where gender equality and primary prevention were reasonably well understood prior to COVID, they could maximise the opportunities as they moved to response. We found workers who were in organisations that really didn't have a good understanding of gender equality and primary prevention prior to COVID simply could not make any use of those opportunities and found themselves actually drowning in many, many ways. So it says a lot about pre-planning, which is, again, a good principle of disaster management. We found an increased awareness of the differential impacts of disaster on different groups of women, including increased risk of family violence. And as Adele has said, and Carla, these included economically disadvantaged women, women in precarious employment in sectors most affected by COVID-19 restrictions, and women who are part of other marginalised groups, including women from particular ethnic communities, women with disability and sexual and gender diverse women, LGB women and T women, and Aboriginal women. So we found that there was an increasing awareness of what is now being called an intersectional lens, so that people who were talking about had been shift to response could actually also talk about the ways in which the impact of gendered inequalities on family violence were cross-cut by these other social determinants. The third positive, if you like, was, again, as Adele has mentioned, a number of women talked about increased flexibility in the move to homework and the move to online service delivery. And many of our people we talked to saw these as likely to be permanent changes in their work conditions, that their organisations would take up some of these changes post-COVID. So they talked about increasing flexibility, being able to balance work and familial responsibilities, reduce travel time. So women in regional and rural areas were talking about suddenly being able to participate in programs and services that have been centred in Melbourne but could now be delivered online and having access to those for the first time. And a number of women talked about the new opportunities for meetings and training and support that online service delivery offered them. Two challenges. As Greta pointed out, a number of people have said in different ways, under disaster conditions, you get an escalation of pre-existing inequalities. And for many of the workers we talked to who had moved into response, they had a great hope that the raised awareness of the importance of primary prevention would get bedded down in policy post-COVID, particularly an understanding of the importance of primary prevention and the maintenance of primary prevention during disaster like COVID. They were hoping that they wouldn't find that we just go back into a cycle of repeat. All that knowledge drops away, go back to business as usual. We have the next disaster, there's a spike in family violence and resources get transferred again from prevention to response. So one of the opportunities, but also a challenge, is how to take this new learnings and make sure they get embedded in policy, not just family violence policy, but also a disaster planning and relief policy. And the second issue was many of these were all our interviewees were women, and of course, as you all know much better than me, the primary prevention workforce is almost is one where women are massively overrepresented. A number of women who were moved from prevention to response, it was a knee-jerk reaction, it happened very suddenly. They were left having to manage their relationships with their previous prevention work, how much they brought on, whether they could or they couldn't. At the same time, many of these three of our women had young children at home, and they were having to renegotiate the domestic workspace and their own work. There were no increased resources or understanding of the gendered nature of those divisions, of those shifts. So the gendered nature of the women who had to suddenly balance and reconsider their prevention work, the mental health and stress issues, at the same time as many of these women are also having to renegotiate the relationships within their domestic space. And so a number of them talked about a gendered lens being brought to the increased support and mental health provisions being provided during COVID. And I think that, not necessarily expected, but it was said very, very clearly. And finally, again, to Adele's point about the movement to online service delivery, we had a number of people talking about the benefits, but also the challenges. So new safety protocols, that if you're delivering primary prevention work, there's issues around people being triggered, there's issues about people being in domestic spaces where a perpetrator or potential perpetrator is in the building. How do you build in new protocols when that work was done face-to-face? You had a particular way of approaching. A number of people talked about how you provide an online equivalent of the physical safe spaces that women, particularly survivor of domestic violence, would meet, where that physical interaction, those safe spaces were absolutely crucial to disclosure, to feeling comfortable, to information exchange. How do you translate those into an online environment? How do you make sure that virtual space, you understand the gendering of virtual spaces? And a number of people said that might be very, very difficult. Yes, so I hope that gives a bit of a sense of the work.
Thanks, Liam. That's really interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing those reports, actually, because I think they'll have some very rich information for us and how this sector proceeds in relation to its development. So thank you, and thanks for sharing what you could with us. I guess my last question, or my last, I guess, proposition to you all is the same. And I guess we know that COVID-19 and other pandemics like this will kind of change the way we live, and it's created a bit of a new normal, hopefully very soon for us in Victoria. We've talked about the multiple inequalities that have been exacerbated during the crisis and how they intersect. We've seen some good stories about community-led solutions and the innovations and where we found opportunities. I guess the last really question today for all the panel is, how do we use this time as an opportunity to shape a more equal and respectful society? So I might go the other way, and I might start with you, Liam, this time. Surprise.
I've got nothing formally prepared. I was talking to Deb this morning or last night, and I realised I'd missed a third bit of the questioning. But I wanted to take a step back.
Yeah.
I think in Victoria, and I'll just talk about the Victorian population, we have an entire state population that has had an extended period of living under disaster conditions and under crisis conditions. And I can pull out some of the characteristics, and most of the mental health research is looking at these. So increased anxiety, a certain sort of hypervigilance where you're watching your behaviour, your health behaviours, who you're in contact with, a heightened self-awareness, but not in the psychoanalytic sense, a heightened sense awareness of almost anxiety again. And the whole population, I think, has experienced that for the first time. And it strikes me in the work I've been doing on LGBTIQ plus people, that COVID was just another in a rolling series of disasters. We had safe schools, the equal marriage debate, and for those of you who don't know, the possibility of the passage of the religious discrimination bill. And over that 5 years, really, if you were an LGBTIQ plus person, we were open slather for right-wing conservative groups to actually air their feelings. And we were already in a heightened state of anxiety. It then struck me that for many minority groups, we live in a heightened state of anxiety as part of our everyday lives. That's true of LGBTIQ plus people. I'm sure it's true of Aboriginal Australians. I think it's true of women. I think it's true of many minority and marginal groups, that level of hypervigilance, that slightly increased anxiety, that almost living in a crisis situation is really part of being a marginal and a minority group in Australia. I'm not saying our experiences are the same for those groups, but that sense of almost, so you're always watching out when you walk into a new situation. You're always at a slightly heightened level of anxiety. So one thing that I think, which I hadn't thought about till this morning, is for all those people, and I won't name groups, who've never had that experience, for whom their sense of entitlement is so woven into their everyday lives that they cannot understand what it's like for minority and marginal groups to live in that heightened sense of anxiety and awareness. I think it is perhaps their experiences of that is a point of empathetic connection to get them to a greater understanding that we can talk about structural and systemic discrimination as we need to, but the lived effect of that for marginal minority groups often is a very different way of being in the world. And I don't think until now, many people who are very sure of their position, who feel very entitled, have ever understood what that would mean. And I would point to the 7 months of COVID to say, well, anxiety, hypervigilance, that's actually the way many marginal minority groups experience the fundamental part of who they are. So there's a weird, I know it's an unexpected, there's a weird opportunity, I think, for starting to have discussions at that level. Thank you, that's me.
That's great, very insightful even without preparation, so thank you. Deb, do you want to add something to your views about how we might use this opportunity to shape a more safe and respectful society?
Yeah, I would. Thanks, Tanya. I think that action is needed, as virtually everyone said, and Carla was saying really strongly, we need to act, not just to hear. Secondly, we've got gender and emergency management guidelines, and they talk about including various voices, you know, from all the different marginalised groups, excuse me, at every stage of emergency management planning. When we had the task force in Victoria with the Emergency Management Commissioner heading it up with Susie Reid, who was the CEO of Women's Health Club in North East, because of Bob Pease being a member, he said, let's nominate someone at the start of every meeting to observe the gender dynamics. And that was fascinating. We did that for 3 years. And sometimes people would point out, you interrupted her. You know, if anyone watched Q&A last night, you know what I'm talking about. That's a really useful thing, to have an observer of gender dynamics, you know, race dynamics, class, you could do anything. That issue that Adele mentioned of broad gender inequality in employment and needing a structural response is so true. And I'll just finish with the notion of heroes. It's such an unhelpful term. Even the CFA has said, don't call us heroes because we can't live up to that. It just adds to the pressure. And I think the reason it hasn't taken off in COVID is because it's applying to women, it's applying to essential workers, which is a better term. And really, they want to keep that term hero for the iconic firefighter with the woman over the shoulder climbing up the ladder. And the awards are for that. The awards were not for women who put those kids in the car and drove out in terrifying conditions. The awards went to the men on the trucks. So I think the last point I'll say is about the Metropolitan Fire Brigade. They haven't been able to increase their number of women beyond 5%. They've been trying for years. Huge cultural problem. And a big part of it is, we also did a study on LGBTI people in the MFB, that if firefighters include women and gay men, what does that say about that image of the big, strong, macho bloke? So that whole issue of gender equality, which is such a key driver, you know, we need to think about that in terms like heroes too. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Deb. Really important points. Carla, what some of your last comments around this idea of how we shape a more safe and equal, society?
I think just to, I agree with everything that, you know, Liam, Deb, Adele have said so far in relation to, you know, we need to think about how we act and think about the impacts on marginalised groups and that different level of understanding. But I think, you know, one of the really important things, and Aboriginal people have always been, you know, kind of on the receiving end of this, but COVID has really sort of highlighted that heavily policed responses, or, you know, those kind of justice responses to health issues are not the solution, not for any of us, not for our marginalised communities, and not for any Australians, period. That the answer to solving some of these issues for us, whether it be a health crisis or otherwise, is not a criminal response. it needs to be really, really pulled apart and picked apart and considered why that's the case. And we know, you know, Australia as Australia was built on the back of a criminal system. It was a place of punishment. And, you know, that system of criminalising people and punishing people has endured since the day that non-Indigenous people arrived here. And the impacts of that have always been felt by, you know, people who are marginalised in whatever way, shape or form. And when we think about how we consider this in the context of prevention of violence against women in particular, is really just not placing more of a burden on those who are already marginalised to also solve the problem. Aboriginal expertise, you know, the voices of women, the voices of marginalised communities in understanding what is happening in their communities is essential. And this work can't be done without it. But more often than not, it becomes more of a burden and more of an assumption that the people who are being victimised and marginalised somehow also have to be responsible for ending that when they're not the ones who are perpetrating it. And it's something that just isn't sort of thought about and figured out enough. And that burden of responsibility continually being placed on marginalised people to solve their own problems in a system that they are not responsible for upholding just needs to change and needs to be thought about differently. And that's where the role of non-Indigenous people, community organisations, women's organisations need to think about what their role is in all of this work and really strongly consider how they do something about shifting that. What level of power do they need to hand over? Or how do they advocate in a more effective manner for other people who are more marginalised, you know, than themselves? And it's for the benefit of everybody. That's the thing that I think often gets missed, is that what we do to improve the lives of the most marginalised in our communities actually benefits everybody, and not that that needs to be the single motivation for why we do this work. We need to just do it because it's the right thing. But what we do in this space and how we think about this work and what we do for our, you know, marginalised women really does benefit everybody, because if their lives are improved, then so is everybody's.
Yeah, absolutely, Carla. And I like that because it's the right thing to do. It's a really critical point and I think speaks to people's values. And Adele, some of your...
I'm glad you've left me to the end, Tanya, because pretty much everything's been said. But I would just like to add one thing, which was that it became really clear during the pandemic who's actually, the value of the contribution of caring and to our community. So thinking about the importance of roles like aged care, support, disability carers, child carers, you know, even the people in supermarkets, in food processing, cleaners, how important these roles are to our community. So I think that if, you know, as well as everything that everyone has already talked about, a process of revaluing what it is that is important to us as a society, as a community, would really, I guess, go a long way to, I guess, recognising what the importance of, well, it's, I mean, you know, it's jobs that women do and often many of the marginalised women in our community do. And so I guess, yeah, I'd really like to, if anything changes, I'd really like to see that as a change, that we recognise the value of these roles, that we properly then remunerate them and, you know, make sure that people are paid properly for that work, that it's stable work and, yeah, I guess recognised in every single way.
Thank you, Adele, and thanks to everybody for a really great discussion. I'm kind of conscious we thought we might be able to ask some questions, but I think we're too close to time. But maybe just to point out in the comments that there's a lot of agreement with the themes coming out of this discussion, and some really interesting kind of, I guess, questions around, well, what happens with the, the increasing climate crisis we're going to find, and what does that mean for PVOR and some of the lessons there. So thanks to Jess for highlighting that. And I think there's been a request from the African Women's Families Network for some of the resources, Liam, you were referring to be shared. And Julia from WISE has already shared some of that research, but certainly whenever those projects or the reports are available, we can, if you've registered for this, we can send around the links to the Respect Victoria website where they will be, or colleagues from Respect Victoria can also do so. So I think just to end and just say there are some really critical themes coming out of this discussion, and way too big for just an hour and 15 minutes discussion. So just to recognise that. But these big ideas of structural systemic inequalities, including labour force inequalities, and whether or not this is a really good opportunity to address some of those, the impact and the benefits of community-led solutions and how important they are in the overall mechanism. The issues of the intersecting inequalities, gender plus, a whole range of issues that we've seen come out of COVID. And I think, this idea, of this theme about the adulation of the hero versus the respect and the recognition and the acknowledgement of everybody's contributions during, particularly difficult times, and particularly, in very interesting in minority groups, because they work so hard behind the scenes. So it's really critical point, I think, that came out today. Really interesting theme that's worth further exploration. So I guess just to end, just to say thank you to all our panelists. Really, really good ideas coming out of today. I've really enjoyed being part of the panel and having the privilege to listen to you all. I'm sure our interactions will continue. Also, I just want to point out that thanks to Sarah, who's been the graphic artist, I think, who's been doing the pictures. It's been really great. Thank you, Sarah. So I think we'll end the discussion there. And thank you for everyone's contributions. Thanks to everyone who's made comments. And I hope you all continue to enjoy the rest of PreventX.
Controlled and led the victim centrality, and changing the table and the structures in which those solutions come from is really going to be part of moving towards the solutions. I think if we continue to rely on the systems and structures that we've always relied on, then we continue to see the same results come through from that. One of the things that's been really lovely to see throughout our panel this morning as well was our graphic recorder, Sarah, has been capturing some of our conversations, and we're going to check that out. Can we have a little sneak peek, Sarah? Is that okay? Let's see if we can bring you in here. We know that you've been able to see bits and pieces of it as well as you've been watching the panel. We'll see if we can make this happen. You're a visual person, aren't you, Loz?
Yeah, I don't know if I can make this happen, but yeah, my brain works like that, and I certainly I'm not as great as Sarah, but when I take my notes, I often draw them.
Yeah, Loz is definitely more than I am. Obviously, as you can see from the beautiful artwork behind us, we might see if we can bring that up for you a little bit later. If not, you'll get to see Sarah's beautiful graphic reflections throughout the conference as well. So keep an eye on those as they keep popping up. What we're going to do now is we're about to get ready to move into our Connect and Reflect session. Now, you will have seen in your emails that what this is going to look like is we're going to move from where we are right now. No, stay with us, where we are right now. And then we're going to move over to our good old friends at Zoom. So this is just like, imagine if we were at a real life live venue conference and you were going to go and find your breakout rooms and go and do your thing. You would move from the main hall and you would go off and go into the world of to where you were supposed to be next. This is just like that, but in, you know, virtual conference world. So all you have to do is either click on the link that's in your emails or head to the link that is right there on the screen behind us. Da, 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 da. And what we really want you to do is go and grab a cuppa, fill up your water bottle, take a moment to just let all of the information that you've just received sink in a little bit. We're going to see you over in Zoom. You're going to break up into our breakout rooms. Once you're in your breakout room, we just would love you to take some time to connect with the people around you. We know that those people that you meet in conferences are often some of the most important bits of information or, you know, connections that you sort of make throughout that can make the difference. So don't forget to introduce yourself, your name, your role, where you're from. And if you'd like to share one key takeaway or reflection or something that you're thinking or wondering at the moment with your group, that'd be fantastic. We would love for you to do that. We've got time to move through 2 rounds of our breakout rooms. So you'll have about 8 minutes in each breakout room. So do be mindful of the time and make sure that everybody gets a go at sharing. So what we're going to do now is we're going to head on over to Zoom, grab your popcorn, put the kettle on, and our breakout rooms are going to start at 12:07, which means you've got 5 minutes. You ready? We'll see you soon. See you at Zoom. Go and stretch those legs, grab a cuppa, find your popcorn. Oh, hello, everybody. You found us in Zoom land. Fascinatingly, it looks exactly the same as StreamYard land, but you made it over. Well done. I really hope that you've started eating your popcorn. Congratulations if your popcorn even made it to today. Let's be honest. I ate mine. We had a trial run in the studio here last week, and mine didn't actually make it out the door of the studio. So this is a prop. It's empty. Sorry, I should probably contribute to this conversation. I hope you've had time to make yourself a cuppa. It's been like a really, really long day with some intense learnings and reflections. So thanks for staying with us. And like now's really an opportunity where you get to catch up with your peers and we get to hear from you and you get to share with others what some of your reflections of today's been. Behind me, it's all about the artwork, but God, that side. Is the reflection piece of artwork, which I really like. It kind of looks like a big pond, big lake. So that's the reflection artwork that, yeah. And this is probably a really nice time to start to introduce a little bit of the pebbles. So when you're thinking about, when we were thinking about this reflection artwork, which is over behind Laws's head over there, and thinking about it being a pond, and now's some time for you to sit by the pond and hold your pebble in your hand and think about what that little piece of information is, or that takeaway, or that reflection that you've really grabbed onto today. And for today, we really just want you to hold onto it and sit with it for a moment. And if you haven't found your pebble yet from today, if you're still looking for that takeaway or that connection, this could be that session that you pick up that pebble in and you look for that person or that connection. Maybe there's a piece of work that you're thinking that, geez, I just wish that I could chat to somebody about, you know, policies in the workplace. Maybe you're looking for that person. It's okay to ask. Throw it out there in the world. Just say, you know, my name's Sarah and I'm looking for someone to help guide me through X, Y, and Z. So looking forward to, yeah, as Law said, letting you guys have some time to stop listening to us and start hearing from each other. So nice. Yeah. I think we've done we've shifted to online learning and programs, and I'm sure you all have too. And I think breakouts from our program participants
view is like they love that time to connect and
share with each other. And as we said a little bit earlier in the session as well, when we were hearing from our some of the sector experts, in that you're all experts in the spaces that you're in as well, and you all have gold and information to share with the group. And that's the really exciting part about the breakout rooms, is that
I think we're wrapping up,
letting you have your voice.
and now you're going to like disappear into your own little breakup rooms.
Alrighties. Well,
we'll see you soon though.
We will see you very, very, very soon. Remember, grab onto that pebble. Go
and
find
have some important yarns.
We'll see you soon.